From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Van Schie, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Dr Aiysha Malik. How are you today, Aiysha?
Hi, Jason. I'm not too bad considering it's dinner time over here and I haven't eaten yet. So I'm getting a bit hangry, but I should be okay.
I've got you covered. I just got off a flight from Sydney and I've come into work. I've had a quick shower, got a coffee, and we're on. And I believe our guest for today is a bit rushed as well. There's actually, it's all been going on for all three of us today. So
yeah, we're all on different time zones and had different days, and it'll be interesting.
It will be interesting, but I'm really excited about this guest, so I want to bring her on straight away. So today we've got someone who is a clinical psychologist by training, like Aiysha, and holds a doctorate in clinical psychology and a PhD in psychiatry. She coordinated the recent publication of the World Health Organization Guidelines and WHO and ILO policy brief on mental health at work. And that's something that we've been talking about a lot, and really excited to talk about it today. She is a mental health specialist and a focal person for workplace mental health at the World Health Organization. A very warm welcome to the podcast, all the way from Geneva, Dr Aiysha Malik.
Thank you so much for having me, Jason and Aiysha.
He said your name right. Yay, Jason.
Yeah. It's one of those few times I remember to ask, so I didn't butcher it. That's how excited we are to have you on, Aiysha.
Yeah, workplace respect. It's fantastic. We're modelling it right here with correct name pronunciation.
Yeah, but really interested to get into today.
Me too.
So Aiysha, we asked this of all of our podcast guests, whether you listen to or have any favorite podcasts that you would like to share, or any resources that you access.
I suppose in terms of podcasts, I actually try very hard outside of my working life to listen to things that are completely different to what I focus my work in. So actually, I don't know if it's my favorite podcast, but it's certainly one that I've been listening to the longest, and it's by a young man from the United States called Lewis Howes. And he is, I think, probably one of those productivity lifestyle type podcasters. But what I like about him a lot is he has had a very adverse series of life events happen to him, but has kind of found his way to reach his point of success at the moment. And I think I follow him more to actually pay attention to who he is, even though that's not necessarily what he's selling as part of his podcast. So covers men's mental health. It's a really neglected topic. Said I didn't listen to things that were related to my work outside of my personal life, so maybe I do. But I think Lewis Howes and the School of Greatness is probably the one that I like to listen to the most.
Nice. So maybe if we move on to just you personally and your background, and Jason's already mentioned you're a clinical psychologist like me by training, and psychiatry as well, but maybe just tell our listeners a bit about your professional career to date.
Yeah, so I think I always wanted to specialise in the area of mental health, so that's why I focused on not only doing a research doctorate, but then also training clinically as well, because I was very interested in supporting people one-to-one or in groups or in families. And I originally worked in the area of, it's called different things in different countries, but let's say medical health psychology or clinical health psychology. And I was focused initially on supporting people who are living with HIV, or people who are attending a sexual health clinic, and that can be for any number of reasons, from very adverse to having difficulties in your personal life. So focused very much on clinical work, and then also moved into the area of training future clinical psychologists as well. So spending some time on a faculty that supported people in reaching that goal of getting that qualification to be a clinical psychologist. I moved quite quickly into international work because that'd always been my intention to move into the international sphere, and initially focused on supporting child and adolescent mental health in humanitarian or low resource settings, and that was with WHO, so testing brief psychological interventions that non-specialist providers can use, because we have an issue worldwide that there aren't mental health specialists or enough worldwide, so we need to train up people who don't come from that background to be able to deliver interventions. So moved into the international sphere with that sort of work as well. And then in WHO have very much focused on different areas of public or global mental health, and one of them being mental health at work. I actually got my first window into mental health at work well before WHO. I did a fellowship at the UK Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, and similarly produced a policy brief or policy note on that topic. So that was my first venture into this area. So it was very nice to come sort of full circle several years later to see this piece of work through with the World Health Organization and with the International Labour Organization.
Yeah, it's great that you found your way into this role, Aiysha, because there's many hands needed, and I think a lot of people, like even Aiysha, has gone from that role where she was more focused on the clinical and the individual and treating symptoms, and going more upstream and looking at how can we do prevention at scale.
Yeah, it is. It's that junction between clinical psychology or clinical health psychology and then occupational health psychology. So it's a big area, and a lot of the time it's who's best placed to be in those roles. So it's good to have a mix, I think, of backgrounds.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about the integrated model, right? And there's different people with different specialties that kind of like will be better placed in certain elements of that. But Aiysha, I'd love to address the elephant in the room. There was an article that I saw recently after this policy brief came out saying that the World Health Organization recommends that yoga be offered within workplaces. Did you see that at all, first of all? Yeah. So do you think that's a fair summary of the guidelines that were produced?
I think let's just start with no, and then that's the TLDR.
And let's get that out of the way. That's good.
Just
yeah.
No, and then I'll expand a little bit. I'll expand a little bit more. I think we have, as part of the guideline, recommended a series of recommendations which cover many different types of things that could address mental health at work. And it's a huge menu, I think it's a huge menu of evidence-based options. And I think later on we're going to talk a little bit more about exactly, what are the different interventions and approaches that we use. But one of the areas that we looked at was this concept of leisure-based physical activity. And what we mean by that, it's not physical labor as part of your job. It's the kind of physical activity that you might participate in as part of an exercise program. And what we happen to find is that at the universal level, the evidence was that for a mix of different activities, whether it's strength training, whether it's aerobic training, whether it's walking or yoga, is actually something that seems to improve people's mental health and, in some cases, improved work-related outcomes. So the concept of something like workability. So we made a recommendation, a conditional recommendation, and specified in the guideline, if you have the resources, if you are a work setting which has the resources to be able to offer leisure-based physical activity, which can include any of the menu of options I just suggested, then this is an option for you to use as part of a comprehensive program of implementing the many other recommendations that WHO made. Given that our recommendations include all the way from preventing people experiencing problems with their mental health in the first place at work, all the way through to supporting people actually living with mental health conditions to participate in work. So physical activity is one of many, many different options. And we've specified that if you're a work setting with the resources available, it is an option for you to do it. But does WHO recommend yoga is offered in all offices? No. It's an option. It's one of many options, and we have presented the recommendations in the guideline, certainly for the interventions of organizational and manager training. We've presented those to say, look, these are the big ones. We put them first. is the big ones. Yoga is not an individual recommendation, it's part of physical activity. I hope does that answer it?
Yeah. Look, we're going to go into much more important questions about the guidelines, but I thought we'd clear the air on that one. The article was pretty interesting. Yeah, it was clickbait, right? But then you saw all the yoga practitioners rejoicing, going, "This is yes," and I don't think they even read like the actual guidelines. They just read the article, going.
Absolutely. I don't think anyone who made the headline read the guideline. But at the end of the day, the media has their job to do, so they work. I've had to respect the fact that you're fulfilling your job in the same way that I'm trying to fulfill my job. But working in the press is a really tough job. And I thought, folks, this was a lost opportunity for you to maybe advocate for any change that needs to happen to the way that you might be working to improve your mental health. But so be it. They had a job to fulfill, and that's what they did.
Well, there's two tensions, right? There, as a journalist, I should have integrity about accuracy of information, and they clearly missed that one. But they definitely would have gotten a fair few clicks on the article, I'd imagine, as well. A lot of outrage clicks going, "What the?" But then, hopefully people actually read the guidelines and understood, well, that's actually not what it was about. But thanks for clearing that up. I'd much prefer to talk today and focus on, well, what did you recommend? And I'll hand over to Aiysha to ask the next question.
Yeah. So some of our listeners might not be exactly familiar with the WHO guidelines on mental health at work. So can you give us just a bit of background on why they were developed in the first place?
Huge context for why it was developed in the first place, but I'll try and summarise what our key justifications have been. And we have to bear in mind the context of COVID-19 as well, and to say that we actually had conceptualised going forward with these guidelines before COVID-19 had even happened. And at that point, before sort of 2019, the fact was that 15% of working age adults were living with a mental health condition, a mental disorder. So that is a huge number of people when you think about the fact that almost 60% of the world is in work. So we're talking about absolutely millions of people. So what does that mean from our perspective as WHO? It means that this is a big public health issue. It's something that's affecting a lot of people. And then on top of that, we're talking about a big impact as well. So for the most common mental health conditions like anxiety, like depression, we're seeing 12 billion productive working days lost a year. And what do we mean by they're lost? People might be absent, people might not be working as effectively as they could, people might be leaving their jobs. So this is a health issue that has a huge impact. And then on top of that, we can say it also has a huge cost to society as well. And the figure obviously that we talk about a lot is the fact that the global economy loses $1 trillion per year as a result of anxiety and depression, common mental health conditions, largely due to the impact that it has on productivity. So big public health issue, has a huge impact, needs to therefore be addressed. And the context or the precedence was the fact that there are global instruments that say we ought to address it. Of course, the very important and famous conventions related to occupational health and safety from the ILO, which have come for decades, and the fact that WHO also has a comprehensive mental health action plan. So this is an action plan that says to member states, these are activities that we should be working towards to improve mental health in the world. And that we also have a global strategy. WHO has a global strategy on environment, climate change and health, and that covers the occupational health field. And all of these international instruments are basically saying, we really ought to be protecting mental health at work. But despite the fact that they've existed, there hasn't been as much movement on it from the international side, but also from the community side as well, globally. And one of the things that we were hearing from the ground is people felt that they didn't know what actually works for mental health at work, that it felt like a very messy, very huge, very complex area, and that people were doing different initiatives but not necessarily knowing, does this actually work? Is it effective? Because when we're talking about mental health at work, we're not just talking about does it improve your mental health? We're also talking about the other stakeholder that's interested in, well, does it improve those impact issues as well? So workplaces want to know, is it going to improve absence? Is it going to improve productivity? It seemed like the field was a bit of a mess. So then WHO thought, okay, we have a mechanism for creating evidence-based guidelines. Let's create evidence-based guidelines for mental health at work, which forces us to look into what actually works. That was kind of the thinking behind why we started this work in the first place.
So that's a really important point to highlight, that mental health is a global public health issue, and that to date there hasn't been really much evidence at all in what works when it comes to addressing mental health in the workplace. And the guidelines weren't in response to COVID-19, were they? The pandemic just really brought mental health to the forefront in workplaces.
Exactly, yeah. It was in the pipeline just before COVID started, actually.
And Aiysha, who was involved in the development of the guidelines?
So it's quite a large number of stakeholders. I think I'd broadly try to summarize it. So we've got the World Health Organization, and the World Health Organization is made up of different departments and different offices around the world. So the two departments that were behind these guidelines were the Department of Mental Health and Substance Use, which is where I sit, and also the Department of Environment, Climate Change and Health, which is where our occupational health experts sit. So this was a guideline that brought together two different fields to work towards a common goal. And we had a steering committee at WHO that was formed of representatives from different departments who have relevant expertise to various parts of the guideline. We also then had what's known as a guideline development group. And this is a group of experts, and we selected experts in the area of occupational health, mental health, and related areas, or the two areas together, and selected experts that were from representing the different WHO regions. So WHO organises itself by thinking about the world in 6 different regions. So we wanted to make sure we've got people who represent the different regions, and where there is, as good as possible, a balance on other socio-demographic statuses. And this is our core expert group that kind of follows us throughout the journey from start to finish, so the guideline development group. We also then have what we call an external review group as well, and these are people who might be consulted at different times throughout the process, and definitely at the point of review before we publish. And these are persons who are very diverse in their expertise. We've got academics to implementers to the representative bodies for workers and employers and the unions and special professional groups as well. So very diverse mix of stakeholders, again, where possible, representing all of the WHO regions and a balance on other socio-demographic statuses. We then had about 7 evidence teams because this whole piece of work is about looking at the evidence, and there's a huge amount of evidence. So we had 7 evidence teams working for us on different aspects of looking at the evidence. And of course, although they're not directly involved, we have our funders, the Wellcome Trust, who of course without their support we wouldn't have been able to have all these people involved and to be able to develop this guideline.
It's great to hear that there was such a broad input from experts in relevant fields to region representatives across the 6 regions, as well as the dedicated evidence teams who reviewed the literature to ensure that the recommendations were actually evidence-based. Can you describe the process that was followed to come up with the final guidelines and recommendations?
Yeah, good question. So we have a pretty standardized process in WHO for developing guidelines. And if anyone is really interested, I always say this, if anyone is really interested, you can actually find it all in our WHO handbook for guideline development, which is publicly available online. And this is a set process that allows WHO to meet sort of international standards for producing global public health guidance of a high level. So the way that we did this process is we first of all tried to scope, well, this is a really big topic. What should we be focusing on? What do people and the experts think we ought to be directing our attention towards? So we initially started off with a kickoff meeting November 2019 to kind of hear from different experts, different policymakers, different implementers, different representatives on what's your area of work and where do you think the focus should be for this guideline. And through that process that we call a scoping process, it allowed us to hone in a particular direction. So then we picked a group of the guideline development group. We picked the guideline development group experts and we brought them together and said, Well, this is the scope or the direction that's been decided and that you've decided as well. How should we then go about finding the right evidence to answer this scope? Because as part of the scope, what WHO is doing is saying, well, what interventions should we focus on? What are the populations that we focus on? So we sort of picked those and made those decisions. So we focused on a broad range of interventions and a pretty broad range of populations as well. And the key then is to go, well, in order to find the evidence, we need to ask good questions, because those good questions are going to go on to become the PICO questions that form the systematic reviews of systematic reviews. So the Guideline Development Group sit down with us, we design the questions, they go through a process of what we call ranking outcomes. What are the outcomes that the Guideline Development Group think are important? So things like mental health outcomes, but work-related outcomes as well, like productivity, absenteeism, etc. And then we design the questions. And then once the questions are designed, so we had multiple different questions to answer multiple different areas of, we had multiple questions to answer multiple different interventions and multiple different populations. We then commission the reviews to take place. We're like, here's the research question. Review team, can you go and look for the evidence? And the evidence that they're looking for is not necessarily just primary trials, what we call like an individual RCT. They're looking for people who have already synthesized the work in that area through a meta-analysis or through a systematic review. And they're pulling that evidence together. But they're not just picking every single paper up. They're using a process to select what's the most highest quality according to rating tools that are used to rate the evidence. And where possible, what is the most recent evidence that we can use? Because WHO guidelines and other public health guidelines like to be as up to date as possible. So they're picking high quality and as recent as possible. Once those papers are picked, once they're like, right, these are the reviews that answer these key questions that we're going to cover for this guideline, then we go through a process of evaluating, well, what is the quality of this evidence, or how certain do we feel about the evidence here? Can we make a recommendation from it? So there's a methodology that they use called GRADE, and through the GRADE process, we're then able to say, okay, this is how certain we feel about the quality of the evidence here. Once that's all done, we present that all to the Guideline Development Group, and the Guideline Development Group look at the evidence. Now, you're thinking, oh gosh, have you just made decisions for the world just based on what some effect sizes are saying in some review papers? And no, we haven't, because there's important evidence or important information that the Guideline Development Group have to consider when they're making these recommendations. And we call this the sort of evidence to decision process. So we bring the experts together and we say, well, this is what the pure literature, the scientific literature says, but we also know about these other important criteria that we need to think about when we're making a decision. So that might be human rights. It might be how many resources are required to actually deliver this intervention. Is this something that WHO can recommend if it's going to be super expensive everywhere? Probably not. Is it going to be socially, culturally acceptable, etc.? So there's different factors that the expert group systematically take into account when they look at the scientific evidence. And then together, as part of looking at this scientific evidence and looking also at the factors that affect the decision making, they come to a decision. And that decision is, well, what should the recommendation be? Can we recommend the intervention? If we're going to recommend it, what should we be saying? So they go through a process of crafting the words of the recommendation. And then they go through a process of deciding how firmly they feel about that recommendation as well. So that's the process that leads us to the point of having WHO recommendations. Then, of course, we go through international review, and then WHO has its own quality assurance processes as well before we can publish and disseminate. But that's just a very long, I think, overview of the volume of work that goes into producing these, that it's not just entirely opinion-based, but it's science and evidence-based as well, but it balances that with people's expertise, people's knowledge about what actually works in certain contexts, etc.
Aisha, well, I think we could have spent the whole episode just going through like how how it was produced. That's a serious. I can't believe that was done in 3 years with a group as big as you detailed. I mean, that's an amazing amount of work.
It is. Sorry, I keep interrupting you. I think the challenge is the big challenge, of course, was experiencing then the pandemic in as part during the process, and it. We had to have some conversations and think about, well, is the decision of how we've decided to go with this guideline, does that still make sense now that this pandemic is happening? Because we've just observed a completely unprecedented scenario that's changed how everybody is working. And we decided, actually, let's keep going in this direction with the scope that we decided, because the lessons learned from the pandemic are still being learned. The evidence wasn't there at the time to be jumping on and making those kinds of recommendations. And I think people might be disappointed in that. I think people might have been expecting us, because of the timing, to say things about, well, how should we do hybrid working, and should we all go back to the office or not? And there's ways that we can answer that with the current recommendations, but I think we stuck with what we know makes sense, regardless of whether or not there is an emergency context going on.
Yeah, and that makes sense. It means it's evergreen, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So given, obviously there's a lot of academics, and the process that you followed was very formulaic, right? Who are the guidelines aimed at? Who's actually going to be using these?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the way that we framed it is the recommendations themselves are probably the most useful for people who have a responsibility in either implementing or actually planning the implementation, or what we call programming, any work that's around people's health and safety at work, or the health and safety of workers in a given workplace or a given district. So you might be a practitioner or a provider who would want to know about the recommendations to be able to be assured that what you are doing is based in the evidence, or to question maybe methods that you've been using before to say, okay, maybe that's not been working as well as I had hoped it to, and in fact it makes sense why, because the evidence base suggests that it's not as effective for this particular outcome or this particular outcome. So the idea is that it is the guideline itself is very much focused on the people responsible for actually directly supporting workers. But we have an accompanying publication, and that accompanying publication is the policy brief that has been published jointly with the International Labour Organization. And that's very much focused towards decision makers, either in government or either at the workplace level. So decision makers with regards to, what should we be doing in terms of actually policy planning for mental health at work, and what should we be doing actually in terms of where we invest for mental health at work. And that policy brief brings together the guideline, the recommendations from the guideline, but puts it into a practical context and a framework that's designed to put it into context for the decision makers in the area of mental health at work.
Yeah. Now there were you were speaking about the guidelines, right? And there were a number of recommendations made in the guidelines. So can you maybe just give us a brief summary, not in detail, because we don't have 5 hours to unpack them and the evidence that sits behind each of these recommendations, but what's the brief summary overview for our listeners?
I'd say that the brief summary is, number one, we're making recommendations that speak to preventing the risks to mental health at work. So we've made recommendations that relate to the concept of organisational interventions being a means to address risks to mental health at work. So that's area one. I think area two is we've made recommendations that speak to the issue of protecting and promoting people's mental health at work. And the strongest recommendation that we have there is for training managers in the concept of manager training for mental health, because it not only skills up managers but also and gives them the confidence to support their workers, but it also seems to have an impact on workers themselves being able to seek support if their manager's gone through that training. And the protect and promote recommendations also include things like workers training for mental health, so training people in mental health literacy and awareness, and also what we call those individual interventions, which can be psychosocial interventions, stress management type interventions, but also those physical activity interventions as well. But the strongest one under protect and promote is for manager training. And then it also covers recommendations for how do you support people who are living with a mental health condition. So we have recommendations on reasonable accommodations at work. So if you are a worker and you're in work, you should be supported through accommodations at work so that you can equally participate. If you are a worker who has been on sickness absence or leave due to mental health, that you should be supported to return to work, and how you can be supported to return to work. And if you are a person living with a mental health condition and you have not been able to gain access to paid employment, that there is a recommendation for the interventions that can effectively support people to be able to gain that paid employment. So those are the recommendations in a nutshell. We've got recommendations around prevention, recommendations around protection and promotion, and recommendations about supporting people living with a mental health condition. So is that the summary that you needed?
Yeah, and look, our listeners would be really used to that sort of terminology because we regularly refer to the integrated model from Anthony LaMontagne, and it looks very close to his work. So was he involved in your panels?
Yes, he was a member of our Guideline development group. So we had Anthony LaMontagne, because this is an Australian podcast, if I'm correct. So we had Anthony LaMontagne, yep. And we had Samuel Harvey as well. Both of whom very fantastic people to work with, very knowledgeable. And I think one of the reflections that people have had post the publication or even during the publication is, well, this seems very similar to this particular product that we released, or this particular ideology, or this particular thinking. And I'm like, yes, that's fantastic, because that means that we're all building around the same message of the evidence base. So I see that as a huge positive, and it's good if we're saying similar things. And I suppose that probably something that your listeners may or may not be interested in is the fact that WHO guidelines are not static. We expect to revise them again in 5 years' time is usually the time frame that we use. So the idea is that people are continuing to add to the evidence or continuing to change the evidence to see if things completely and utterly change. So the idea being that this is an evolving process, an evolving thinking as well. Science is never static.
Yeah, and that's what I think a lot of people don't understand or don't practice as well, where they'll go, oh, this intervention, growth mindset, let's just say that for an example, it worked in this context and look at the evidence behind it. Great, we're going to take that and put it into our context and expect it to work the same. But then they don't actually measure it to actually see if it has an impact or if it is working properly, or iterating and making, they're not taking an evidence-based approach. So that's what science is, right? We put it in, we measure, we adapt if needed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think and science-based approach is good, but we have to also think about, I think you need the scientists, but you need the practitioners as well. You can't just have one person pushing an agenda or a message forward, and we needed both, which is why we had such a mix of people involved in this process. You need the practitioners to tell the scientists the reality on the ground. And so on. So it's why you need to always work with, I think, a big diversity of professionals. And I think mental health at work is very diverse in who can be involved in it.
Yeah, we do see sometimes academics do maybe control the room a bit more when you do bring them together. But like you say, every voice is actually really important. This might be sound theoretical underpinnings. The science makes sense from an academic perspective, but on the ground it might not work, and in different contexts it might not work. But you talked about how it's based on evidence, and I was surprised to see so many low evidence recommendations in there. So maybe just explain to the listeners first of all what's the different certainty of evidence classifications and what do they mean?
Yeah. So we've got so when you see a WHO recommendation, so I think what you're trying to say is you see the statement like WHO recommends that organisational intervention should be used, and then you see this line that says very low certainty of evidence. And it's a line that can seem confusing. And sometimes what you'll also see is low certainty of evidence or moderate certainty of evidence, and you don't see it in this guideline, but you might see it in others, high certainty of evidence. What this is talking about is how confident are we that the effect, so how good the literature is currently showing that intervention is on those particular outcomes. So how confident are we that if we were to repeat more research in the future, that would or would not drastically change? So very low certainty means we don't feel so confident. It could be that if we repeat, do more research, that effect might change. Change isn't necessarily a bad thing. It could mean that it shows it's stronger. It could mean that it shows it's worse. It could mean that it shows that something that we thought was positive is no longer positive, although we don't usually believe that. So the idea is it's demonstrating, because of the quality of the research as it is, the state of the current research, we are telling you how confident we feel that this may or may not change should there be future research on this particular item. It doesn't always necessarily mean something negative, because I think very low certainty can ring alarm bells for people. And in fact, it's really normal in the area of mental health to have very low certainty. And there's a whole philosophy around why that might be. I can dive into it if you want me to, or not. No.
No, again, I think that we don't really have time to go into that today.
Okay, so we'll leave it at the recommendations being classified in a range of very low certainty to high certainty in terms of whether they are likely to be effective or not. So the recommendations are also noted as strong or conditional. What determined whether a recommendation was actually strong or conditional?
Yeah, the process of determining if something is strong or conditional is actually done by a vote, and the voting rights are given to the guideline development group experts. So we ask them to vote for it. It's not something that we decide, and majority vote wins. So if the majority say it's a strong recommendation, it's a strong recommendation. The majority say we think this is conditional, it's conditional. And what do we actually mean by those two? That the strong recommendation is where you feel that if people were to actually do this recommendation, then it's going to have benefits, and it's going to have more benefits than it is going to have problems. We feel really confident that if you do this, it's the right thing to do. A conditional recommendation is one where you're saying we still recommend this. We just probably think the benefits are better than what we call undesirable effects might be of doing this. We think that if you do this in many different places, but maybe not all places, we think that this would be a good idea. And sometimes what influences whether something is strong or conditional can be the quality of the evidence, but it can be human rights as well. If there's a human rights decision behind something, then that starts to lean towards being a strong decision, because it's usually a good thing to do. And if it's a case of, we know lots of this literature, say for example on stress management interventions, comes from high-income countries. So we feel pretty good that a well-resourced high-income country can do it, but we're not sure about all contexts necessarily. Doesn't mean stress management interventions are bad. We're still recommending them, but it just becomes conditional because we're not so certain. So it starts to speak a little bit also to what's the state of the evidence and the diversity in the evidence as well. But it's the GDG that vote for it.
Yeah, it's I guess the World Health Organization obviously has that global remit, right? And so it makes sense that you need to think about, not only is there good evidence behind it, but is it affordable, is it transferable globally, exactly, and whatnot. But with the different levels of evidence, what can researchers and practitioners do to increase, I guess, the evidence base behind some of these recommendations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's part of what the focus of the guideline has been in some ways, because what we also do when we publish WHO guidelines is we also include, what are the gaps in the research? So on the one hand, practitioners could look at, I won't go through the whole list, but can look at the section that we have called research gaps, and those are topical research gaps. You know, we're missing information in low and middle income countries, we're missing research that's come from SMEs, for example, or we're missing research that actually reflects so different people of different social demographic backgrounds, whether it's race, whether it's gender, etc. The other is to actually think about the quality of the research itself, and to do that you need to start to dive a little bit more into how did we evaluate the certainty of the evidence using grade methodology. If you look into grade, it has certain criteria on what actually affects our decisions if we reduce the certainty of the evidence. So it can be things like a review has included studies where people are from very different backgrounds and very different populations. So it's a bit too what we call heterogeneous, and that makes us reduce kind of the quality rating for the evidence. Or it might be things like, and this is the biggest issue that we have in mental health, they're not necessarily very well controlled studies. As soon as something isn't an RCT or a controlled study, it reduces the quality. I think I hear too often that RCTs aren't possible in work settings. I think I would like to debunk that as much as possible. They are possible. We saw plenty of RCTs as an example. But what I think we need people to think about is the strength of the design of their research. But many of us are affected by the fact that mental health is underinvested in. If it's underinvested in, you can't do a high quality trial because RCTs are super expensive. And so it's a bit of a systemic cycle of, we need the quality of the science to improve. Everybody's a very bright person in this field. They know how to improve the quality of the science, but that means we need donors to invest in it so that we can do good quality research.
Yeah, and getting that evidence base and getting that design of the, even real world, interventions, the design around the evaluation, as robust as possible, and using randomized controlled trials, as you say. It's difficult, it's a bit more expensive, but it's worthwhile doing. I mean, we were part of something in Victoria where we delivered a funded program to schools and working with Monash University on the evaluation. And they said, hey, we think we can actually do an RCT with this. And we're like, great. But then the funder didn't want to fund the evaluation to that degree, and we really had to scope down. Well, fortunately, we did get to do the RCT, but we had to fight tooth and nail and really get them to expand on the percentage of the total funding that we could use towards evaluation to make sure that any findings that we got from our real world intervention would be transferable and would be acceptable by others. So it's doable, but it's a bit more expensive. But when we've got government funded programs, then they need to allow for a bit more funding towards the evaluation component.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's good to hear that story from you, because it means you've had a similar battle. So what I'm saying isn't totally foreign, but in the same way, we can't be. The reality is, can we be pushing everybody to be striving and pushing for doing an RCT? No, we can't. So that means if you can't do one, for all intents and purposes, make sure that other aspects of your research are as well designed as possible. And it's not just the people doing the individual research, it's the people reviewing the existing research as well. Don't just mash a bunch of interventions together and run a meta-analysis. Really do think about how precise your systematic review is as well. So there's two sides to this. It's the reviewers themselves, but it's also the direct researchers, and it's the funders. So everybody's got a role.
Aiysha, some of our listeners may be keen to implement the guidelines in their organisations. Where should they start?
My top advice would be, we published the World Health Organization and International Labour Organization policy brief on mental health at work for this precise reason. The guidelines are there as your backing book of why we made certain recommendations and the reasons behind them. If you want to dive into it, go for it. The recommendations at the front in the executive summary of the guideline just give you, that's what you need to look at if you're not a professional with not a lot of time. But it's the policy brief that's 20 pages long. It's designed to be a little bit easier to read. And what the policy brief does is it integrates the recommendations from the WHO guidelines alongside all of the guidance and recommendations and more practically focused work that the International Labour Organization has done, and it merges them together. And it gives messages directed for if you're a government stakeholder, so if you're working, it could be even at the district level, not just at the national level, if you're working in either labour or either social affairs or health, right? It doesn't have to just be mental health, it's health or labour. Or if you are a stakeholder who is actually working in the workplace themselves. We branded it as employers, but you can also potentially be an implementer that's responsible. You may be the person allocated to be responsible. And the idea largely with the policy brief is to say, do you, as your work setting, if that's where you're based, do you have a policy in place that covers mental health at work in this way? And if you don't, do you have an OSH policy? I really should do, but do you have an OSH policy that doesn't cover mental health, that maybe mental health needs to be integrated into? So the policy brief gives ingredients of different things that can be considered, or I would use it almost as like a trigger reminder of have we considered certain elements, because we can't cover everything for every single workplace ever, but it's almost like a list of triggers of like, have we covered this in our policy? Can I use this document as a means to advocate for increased budget to mental health in my work setting? That's another big thing, is it's tends to get lost in budget lines. Mental health, the stigma for mental health exists from the individual level through to the funding level. So are you able to use the policy brief and the work that ILO and the World Health Organization have done to actually advocate to your senior leadership for what needs to be done? You may be senior leadership with absolutely no mental health person allocated to focus on the welfare of your staff. What does that mean? Maybe you're very passionate, maybe you're a person with lived experience of mental health and you happen to be in a senior leadership position. You can use this similarly to push for what might need to be in place, because we're talking not just about a policy, but there's an infrastructure for mental health within the workplace as well. This isn't just what we sometimes see is there's just one person or one counsellor allocated to the role of dealing with mental health in an entire organisation, and that's not possible. If anything, what we've learned is this requires actors from across the field. It's not a one-person job. It really requires what we call multi-stakeholder or multi-sectoral effort, and that also counts in the work setting. I'll stop there.
Yeah, Aiysha, it sounds like the World Health Organization has been listening to this podcast when developing those guidelines, because I think that our listeners will be very familiar with all that sort of language. But it's, it was, I would say that the policy brief is a great abstract. I love abstracts. It does get the message across quite concisely. Listeners might still think 20 pages, but like you say, it's actually very easy to read. Nice tables and well displayed information, but follows a nice, that integrated framework that is being used here in Australia. And it's great to see the World Health Organization using the same framework, and really great to see psychosocial risk management front and center as the first recommendation in the policy brief. So terrific for those of our listeners who are really trying to advocate, like you say, advocate internally for resources and budget, and explain why we're doing this. Hey, it's aligned to international best practice from the WHO and ILO. Great. It makes that discussion a lot easier. But I'm just conscious of time, Aiysha, so I just have one question that I'd like to ask you before, it's quite an aspirational question we like to ask all of our guests, is what are your hopes for the future of mental health at work?
Well, that is an aspirational question. I think for me, first and foremost, it has to be that people who are living with mental health conditions are supported when they're in work, can access work when they want to access work, and become part of what we mean when we call for diverse workforces. Stigma is such a massive problem. It's so good that people are talking about mental health more and more, but it is still really stigmatized, and people living with mental health conditions will be the first to tell you that they are continuing to experience that. And so I think it has to be, first of all, that those people living with mental health conditions are supported and can access work. And then the second for me would be in line with what we're saying, that people are prevented from experiencing undue risk in the workplace, that I think that we can recognize that the way that we're working is harmful to our individual health, but also the health of employers and your business as well. So whatever your business goals may be, whether it's financial, whether it's a care industry, that the way that we work and the risks that we experience at work are harming ourselves as individuals, but also our workplace as well. And consequently, that also adds up to harming the health of the world too. So I think supporting people with mental health to be able to participate in work and making sure that we can move towards a culture which means that we're preventing people from experiencing the risks to mental health in their workplace.
You can come back anytime, Aiysha, with those sorts of messages. Yeah, we like that prevention. Like you say, there's so many people who are employed in the world if we think about the entire population. And if workplace can be a facilitator of good mental health rather than actually causing mental ill health, then we're going to have a bigger impact on the whole of communities around the world, not just those that are directly employed by companies. Well, Aiysha, it's been fantastic having you on. Like I said, you're welcome back anytime. But I wish you a great day ahead. We're finishing our days over here in Australia, but you're just starting. So thank you very much for your time today.
You're really welcome. It's been really nice talking to the both of you.
Terrific. Well, listeners, that brings us to the end of this episode. Remember, we do video these when we're having these conversations, so you can check out the video on the YouTube channel for Flourish DX. We also will take some of the best clips from Aiysha. Oh, there I did it. I just buggered up the name. Sorry. Aiysha.
No, you're right. At least you caught it. You caught it. That's what counts.
Okay. Is it? Does it really? Okay. I'll take that one.
It really does. Trust me.
Okay. I do care. As much as I butcher people's names, I do actually care. So Aiysha, we'll put up some clips from Aiysha on the Flourish DX LinkedIn page. And then we'll also, while you're over there, connect with, myself, Alicia, and Aisha's on LinkedIn as well. We've noticed that's how we connected with her. So please do reach out if you want to continue the conversation. But that's it for today, listeners. We'll catch you next episode.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.